The sun flayed the earth with claws of fire, scorching the small border town that stood stubborn and forgotten in that corner of the west. Through the heat mirage, a tiny silhouette emerged from the trembling horizon. It came down the main road, wrapped in a cloud of dust that seemed to devour it, but its steps, though tired, maintained a constant, determined rhythm. Eleanor was barely 10 years old, but her eyes, large and almond-shaped, reflected an inner age much older. Her dress, once blue, now wore the indefinite color of many traveled roads. She had a small bundle of her few belongings tied to her waist, and hanging from her neck, a silver medallion blackened by time. The town seemed to breathe with difficulty under the relentless heat. The closed doors, the drawn curtains, the silence barely interrupted by the occasional creaking of wood dilated by the sun. Everything suggested that life had retreated inward, seeking refuge from that merciless sky. Only one man remained visible, sitting on a rickety bench in front of the saloon, as if the heat couldn't reach him. His face, partially hidden under the brim of a dusty hat, showed deep furrows that were not only of age, but of stories written with pain and loneliness. Next to him, a half-empty bottle gleamed with amber reflections under the unforgiving light. Eleanor stopped a few steps away from him. The smell of whiskey, leather, and sweat enveloped her like a tangible presence. The man seemed like a statue, motionless on that frontier between life and nothingness that was the faded porch. The girl waited, feeling the accelerated beating of her heart against her ribs, swallowing to moisten her parched throat. "Today is my birthday," she finally whispered, her voice broken by thirst and fear. "May I stay here with you for a while?" The question hung in the hot air, fragile as a bubble. The man didn't move immediately. Then, with the deliberate slowness of someone who has neither hurry nor expectations, he raised his head. His eyes, the indefinable color of distant storms, met Elena's. Something imperceptible changed in his hardened gaze. Eternity seemed to concentrate in that instant. The wind dragged an abandoned paper down the deserted street. A crow cawed from the roof of the abandoned church. "The sun will roast you standing there," he finally said, his voice rough but not hostile. A slight movement of his hand indicated the empty space on the bench. Elena approached slowly, like someone approaching, a wild animal, and sat at the end of the bench, maintaining a prudent distance. Her legs, too short to reach the ground, were suspended in the air. Her small hands, hardened by premature work, rested on her lap, unconsciously clutching the medallion. "Thank you, sir," she murmured. Silence spread between them again, but it was a different silence, less lonely. In the distance, the horizon trembled under the heat, and the bluish mountains seemed to observe them with the infinite patience of what has seen entire civilizations pass. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself for the first time in many days the luxury of rest. She didn't know exactly what had led her to that man, to that town. Perhaps it was the instinct that wounded animals develop to find water, or perhaps something deeper, more ancient. The only thing she knew with certainty was that she had nowhere else to go. In her head, like an underground river, flowed the memories of what had been her life until then. The family cabin, the fields that gradually dried up, the increasingly tense faces of her parents, the nightly discussions that pretended to be whispers, and then the morning when she woke up and found only silence, a plate of beans, a brief note, and that medallion on the pillow. Since then, she had wandered following clues that only existed in her stubborn heart, seeking a destiny that she herself didn't understand, until her steps brought her here, to this bench, to this shared silence with a stranger. The man didn't ask anything. He didn't speak of her origin or her destination. He simply allowed the shade of the porch to cover them both, while the day burned around them. And in that mute gesture was more compassion than in all the words of pity that Elena had heard during her journey. The sunset began to tinge the sky with violent colors when the man finally stood up. Without looking back, he walked toward the end of the street, where a solitary cabin stood among dry shrubs. Elena remained seated, watching him walk away, feeling that something new and indefinable was growing in her chest. Before disappearing behind the cabin door, the man stopped and, without fully turning, slightly inclined his head in her direction. A minimal gesture, almost imperceptible to any casual observer, but one that for Elena contained a whole world of possibilities. With her heart lighter than it had been in a long time, She gathered her small bundle and step by step began to follow the silhouette of the man outlined against the flaming sky. The cabin was like an island in the middle of a sea of dry earth and stones. Its wooden walls, aged by the inclemencies of time, seemed to have absorbed all the tonalities of the desert. Inside, the gloom offered refuge from the exterior heat, although the air remained dense and still. Eleanor paused at the threshold, aware of crossing an invisible boundary. The man lit an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the bare walls. The light revealed an austere room, a table with two mismatched chairs, a narrow bed against the back wall, a chest closed with a rusted padlock, a small black iron stove. "It's not much," said the man without looking directly at her. "It's perfect," Elena replied, and in her voice there was a sincerity that surprised them both. The man pointed to a corner where there was a small cot, covered with a worn but clean blanket. "You can sleep there, for now." That "for now" floated between them like an uncertain promise. Elena nodded, leaving her small bundle next to the cot. Her eyes scanned the room, registering every detail: the floorboards that creaked slightly under her weight, a shelf with some books with worn spines, a small mirror with a crack that divided the reflection into two imperfect halves. The man moved with economy of gestures, as if he had learned to exist occupying the least possible space. He put water to boil in a dented kettle and took out bread, dry cheese, and a jar of something that looked like jam from a cupboard. "Eat," he said, pushing a plate toward her. "Tomorrow we'll see." Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each bite. It wasn't just hunger that made her appreciate that simple food. It was also the strange sensation of being, for the first time in a long time, in a place where she didn't have to be alert at every moment. Through the small window, the sky was changing from fire to deep indigo. The first stars began to twinkle, distant and cold. Eleanor remembered how her grandmother had taught her to read the night sky, to recognize the constellations that, according to her, were the spirits of their ancestors watching over them. She wondered if her grandmother was now among those lights, observing her. "What's your name?" asked the man, breaking the silence. "Elena. I'm Samuel." He didn't add more, neither surname nor history, just that bare name, offered like someone handing over an object of little value, but which is all they possess. The girl nodded, storing that name in her memory like someone storing a seed for an uncertain future. Fatigue began to weigh on her eyelids. The tension accumulated during days of walking under the sun, sleeping in the open, and remaining constantly vigilant was now dissolving in that safe space, leaving her vulnerable to exhaustion. Samuel pointed to a wash basin with water and a piece of soap, and then went outside the cabin, offering her privacy to wash. Eleanor appreciated the gesture, although she didn't express her gratitude in words. She had learned that some things are truer when they are not named. As she washed, the water turned grey with the dust of the road. She felt that she was not only cleaning her skin, but also letting go of a part of her recent past. When she finished, she put on the only clean change of clothes she kept in her bundle, a too large smock that had belonged to her mother. Samuel returned when she was already lying on the cot, with the blanket pulled up to her chin despite the persistent heat. He didn't light the lamp, moving in the darkness with the certainty of someone who knows every corner of their refuge. Elena listened to him settling into his bed, the creaking of the springs, the breathing that gradually became deeper and more regular. Outside, the wind had begun to blow, bringing with it the dry aroma of sage and the distant murmur of coyotes. Before succumbing to sleep, her hand instinctively sought the medallion that hung from her neck. It was her only connection to what had been, the only tangible proof that her previous life had not been a dream. Her fingers traced the worn relief, a tree with deep roots and branches extended toward an invisible sky. That night, for the first time since she found herself alone, Elena slept without nightmares. Morning came with an unexpected freshness, as if during the night the desert had exhaled all the accumulated heat. Elena woke up disoriented, taking a few moments to recognize where she was. Light streamed in through the small window, drawing a golden rectangle on the wooden floor. Samuel was already gone. On the table he had left bread, a piece of cheese, and a cup of milk. Next to this simple breakfast, a note written in rough but legible handwriting: "Back at dusk. Don't wander too far." Elena ate slowly, savoring the sensation of having a whole day ahead without the urgency of walking toward an uncertain destination. When she finished, she carefully washed her plate and cup, leaving them to dry in the sun coming through the window. Curiosity, that primordial force that not even hardships had managed to quell in her, drove her to explore the cabin in more detail. She didn't touch the chest closed with a padlock, instinctively respecting that invisible boundary, but she did observe the books on the shelf, agriculture manuals, an old atlas, a Bible with yellowing pages, and a small volume of poetry with a spine so worn that the title was barely distinguishable. What caught her attention most, however, was a framed photograph resting face down in a half-open drawer. The image showed a younger man. She recognized Samuel by his eyes, although then his face didn't bear that burden of years and disillusionment, with a sweet-faced woman and a small child. The three smiled at the camera with the serene confidence of those who believe happiness is a permanent state. Eleanor put the photograph back exactly as she had found it, feeling that she had glimpsed something too intimate, a wound she had no right to touch. When the sun reached its zenith, she decided to venture into town. The main street, which the day before had seemed deserted, now showed signs of life. Some doors were open, letting escape snippets of conversations and food smells. A couple of skinny dogs were disputing a shadow under the porch of the cantina. What irremediably attracted Eleanor's attention was an establishment located almost at the end of the street. A wooden sign, discolored by the sun, announced, "General Store, Suarez Brothers." The facade, painted a blue that stubbornly resisted the erosion of time, contrasted with the uniform, dusty tone of the rest of the buildings. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and something deeper that she couldn't name, Eleanor pushed the door, which announced her entry with the tinkling of a small bell. The interior was a miniature universe. Kitchen utensils, ropes, hats, and objects whose function Eleanor couldn't guess hung from the ceiling. The walls were covered with shelves that housed everything from food to medicines, fabrics, tools, and simple toys. The air smelled of a mixture of freshly ground coffee, leather, spices, and the inevitable dust that permeated everything in that region. Behind the counter, an older woman with white hair pulled back in a severe bun observed her with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. Her face, furrowed by deep wrinkles, seemed carved in ancient wood. "What are you looking for, child?" she asked in a surprisingly melodious voice for her austere appearance. Elena realized that she had no answer to that question. She wasn't looking for anything concrete, and besides, she didn't have money to buy anything. "I was just looking, Mum," she replied timidly. "Your store is like a treasure." Something seemed to soften in the woman's expression. "Are you new around here? I don't remember seeing you before. I arrived yesterday. I'm with Mr. Samuel." A flash of recognition, perhaps surprise, crossed the woman's face. "With Samuel? Now that's a novelty. That man has been living like a hermit for years." She paused, studying Elena with renewed interest. "My name is Doña Carmela. This store was founded by my husband. May he rest in peace, and now I run it with my brother, although he's away seeking new merchandise." Elena nodded, feeling strangely comfortable under that penetrating gaze. "You seem like a smart girl," continued Doña Carmela. "And this place," she made a gesture encompassing the disorderly store, "needs young hands to put it in order. Would you like to help me? I can't pay much, but—" "Yes," Elena interrupted her, with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself. "I'd love to, ma'am." And so, without planning it, Eleanor found her place in that small world. The hours flew by as she helped reorganize shelves, clean jars, label products, and attend to the few customers who entered the store. To her surprise, she discovered that she had a natural talent for order and numbers, calculating change and keeping accounts with a precision that impressed Doña Carmela. "You have a good head for business, little one," the woman commented as they closed the store at dusk. "I expect you again tomorrow if you want." Eleanor left the store with a light heart and a small paper bag containing freshly baked cookies, a gift from Doña Carmela. The town no longer seemed hostile to her. Now she saw the details that haste and fear had hidden from her the day before. The red geraniums in a window, a lazy cat sunning itself, the distant sound of an out-of-tune piano. When she arrived at the cabin, Samuel had already returned. He was sitting on a small improvised porch, carving something in a piece of wood. Seeing her, he put his work aside. "You went to town." It wasn't a question, but a statement. "Yes." Eleanor hesitated for an instant. fearing his disapproval. "I found work at the general store with Doña Carmela." Samuel looked at her for a long time with an indecipherable expression in his grey eyes. "She's a good woman," he finally said. "Tough, but fair." Elena nodded, relieved. Then she extended the bag of cookies toward him, a silent offering of peace, gratitude, and something more that neither of them could name yet. Samuel took a cookie and bit into it slowly, as if he had forgotten the taste of sweet things. A complicit silence settled between them as the sun sank behind the distant mountains, painting the sky crimson and gold. That night, as she lay down, Elena again caressed her medallion, but this time not with the desperation of clinging to a lost past, but with the serenity of one who begins to glimpse a possible future. The days began to follow their own rhythm, like a melody that gradually finds its tempo. Elena divided her time between Doña Carmela's store, where her presence had become indispensable, and Samuel's cabin, which gradually ceased to be a temporary refuge to become something like a home. That Sunday morning, the entire town seemed to have shaken off its usual lethargy. The small adobe church, situated in the central plaza, had opened its doors wide, and the sound of an out-of-tune harmonium was calling the faithful. Elena observed the movement from the door of the store, closed that day out of respect for tradition. Families arrived dressed in their best attire, though by city standards they would surely seem modest clothes. The women wore dresses of subdued colors, but adorned with carefully preserved lace. The men with starched white shirts and hats clean of dust for once. "Aren't you going to Mass, child?" asked Doña Carmela, who had come out to sweep the front of the store despite the festive day. Eleanor shook her head. The church produced a confused mixture of feelings in her. Her mother had been devout, but her maternal grandmother, who had taught her about herbs and stars, professed an older faith, more rooted to the earth itself. "My grandmother said that God is everywhere, not just in churches," she said softly. Doña Carmela looked at her intensely, as if evaluating something she saw beyond the girl's words. "Your grandmother was a wise woman," she finally responded. "Come, I want to show you something." She followed her through a back door that she had never crossed before. They climbed a narrow staircase to reach an attic space that served both as living quarters and as storage for special merchandise. In a corner, covered by a canvas, there was a large rectangular object. With an almost ceremonial gesture, Doña Carmela removed the cloth, revealing a vertical piano of dark wood, with keys yellowed by time, but carefully polished. "It was my daughter's," the woman explained, passing a hand over the lustrous surface of the instrument. "She left for the capital years ago. She said this town was too small for her." There was a contained sadness in her voice, a story that Eleanor sensed was complex and painful. "May I?" she asked, pointing to the keys. Doña Carmela nodded. Elena sat on the stool and placed her fingers on the ivory. She had never played a piano, but her mother had taught her some songs on an old guitar that they had to sell when the drought ravaged their crops. She pressed one key, then another. The notes floated in the dense air of the attic, vibrating with a purity that seemed out of place in that dusty town. Without knowing how, her fingers found a simple melody, a lullaby that her grandmother sang in an almost forgotten language. The music awakened something inside her, as if opening doors that she didn't know existed. She closed her eyes and let her hands wander over the keyboard, finding intuitive harmonies that expressed what words couldn't: the vastness of the desert, the loneliness of nights under the stars, the fear of being abandoned, the faint hope that had begun to bloom in her chest. When she finished, she opened her eyes and found Doña Carmela's wet gaze. "You have a gift, little one," the woman said with a trembling voice. "Music is a language that few truly understand. You can come to play whenever you want." That piano became a secret refuge for Elena. In moments stolen between tasks, she would stealthily climb to the attic and immerse herself in music, exploring the instrument like someone exploring an unknown but welcoming territory. One evening, as she was returning to the cabin, she heard a sound that seemed vaguely familiar. As she approached, she discovered Samuel sitting on the porch, playing a worn harmonica. The melody was melancholic, with the irregular cadence of someone who plays more out of inner necessity than technique. Elena stopped a few steps away, not wanting to interrupt that moment. Samuel seemed transformed, The hard lines of his face softened by a kind of abandonment, as if the music transported him to a place where pain couldn't reach him. When the last note faded in the evening air, Samuel looked up and saw her. For an instant, he seemed embarrassed to have been discovered in this act of vulnerability. "It's beautiful," Elena said simply. Samuel put the harmonica in his shirt pocket over his heart. "My father taught me," he replied, and in those 4 words was a whole world of memory and loss. That night, as they ate in silence, Elena gathered the courage to tell him about Doña Carmela's piano. She told him how the music seemed to flow from her without effort, like water from a hidden spring. "My grandmother said that music is the language with which the spirits of the earth speak," she added, carefully observing Samuel's reaction. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "When I was young, there was a man in my village who played the violin so well that birds would come close to listen to him," he said, surprising Elena with this unusual revelation of his past. "They said he had learned from the coyotes." Elena smiled, imagining the scene. She dared to ask, "Where do you come from, Samuel?" A long silence, but not hostile, followed the question. The crackling of the small bonfire that Samuel had lit outside the cabin was the only sound in the stillness of the desert. "From a place that no longer exists," he finally answered. "At least, not as I remember it." He didn't add more, and Elena understood that there were boundaries she still shouldn't cross. But something had changed between them. The music had bridged the abyss of silence that separated them. That night, before sleeping, Elena took out from her small bundle the only book she had brought with her, a notebook with yellowing pages where her grandmother had noted recipes for remedies, ancient songs, and legends of her people. She leafed through it in the dim light of the lamp, looking for a specific page. There it was, written in her grandmother's irregular handwriting, the story of the medallion that now hung from her neck. According to the family legend, it had been forged by a distant ancestor, a man who knew the language of metals. The engraved tree represented not only the family, but the deep connection with the earth that had fed them for generations. "As long as you wear this medallion," her grandmother had written, "you will never be truly lost. The earth will always recognize you as its own." Eleanor closed the notebook and put it away carefully. Outside, the wind had begun to blow, bringing with it the aroma of sage and moist earth. A storm was approaching, and with it perhaps the promise of change. The sky dawned with a leaden color that did not bode well. Low, dense clouds were dragging themselves from the horizon, laden with a promise that the desert had been waiting for too long. The air had become heavy, electric, as if the entire atmosphere was holding its breath. Elena woke up with a strange uneasiness in her chest. She had dreamed of water, lots of water, and of voices whispering in a forgotten language. Upon opening her eyes, the muffled sound of a distant thunder reverberated through the walls of the cabin. Samuel was already up, securing the shutters and checking the roof. His face showed intense concentration as he worked methodically, preparing for what was coming. "It's going to be a strong storm," he said upon noticing that Elena was watching him. "We haven't seen one like this in years." There was something in his tone, a mixture of respect and apprehension, that made Elena feel a shiver. In her short life, she had learned that nature could be as generous as it was implacable. The same. Rain that brought life could, in its excess, sweep away everything in its path. "You won't go to the store today," Samuel continued, in a tone that admitted no discussion. "Doña Carmela will understand." Elena nodded, recognizing the wisdom of that decision. She helped Samuel finish the preparations. They filled all available containers with clean water, secured provisions in high places, checked that there were no leaks in the roof. As they worked, Eleanor noticed something unusual. The wooden floor, normally solid under her feet, seemed to have yielded slightly at a point near her cot. When Samuel went out to check the stable where he kept his horse, she knelt to examine that anomaly more closely. Indeed, one of the boards was loose. Moved by a curiosity that was stronger than prudence, Eleanor slid her fingers along the edge and lifted the wood. Underneath was a small, dark hole. She inserted her hand, and her fingers touched something, a rectangular object wrapped in a piece of waxed cloth. With her heart beating rapidly, she took out the package and unwrapped it. It was a worn leather book with pages yellowed by time and humidity. On the cover, almost erased, some initials could be distinguished. M.V. The sound of Samuel's steps approaching startled her. Quickly she hid the diary under her pillow and put the board back in place. An inner voice told her that this finding should remain secret, at least for now. She had barely finished when Samuel entered, shaking off the first drops of rain from his hat. "It's starting," he announced, looking toward the window where the drops were hitting with increasing force. "We'd better prepare for a long wait." The following hours passed at the rhythm dictated by the storm. The rain now fell furiously, lashing the roof and walls as if wanting to test their resistance. Lightning intermittently illuminated the interior of the cabin, followed by thunder that made even the bones vibrate. Samuel had sat next to the small stove, occasionally stirring the fire that kept the humidity and cold at bay. His face, illuminated by the glow of the flames, seemed carved in ancient stone. Elena had settled on her cot, pretending to read one of the books from the shelf, while her mind kept thinking about the diary hidden under her pillow. The storm reached its peak at nightfall. The wind howled around the cabin like a wounded beast, and the rain formed impenetrable curtains that distorted reality beyond the windows. Elena had never experienced a natural phenomenon of such magnitude. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time, a reminder that human beings, with all their ingenuity, remained vulnerable to primordial forces. "There's a dry stream a few miles away," Samuel commented, breaking a long silence. "With this rain it will flow again, it might even overflow." There was a note of hope in his voice. Elena understood that for that thirsty land, even a flood was preferable to the prolonged drought that had punished. Gout. When they finally went to bed, the storm had abated enough to allow a few hours of restless sleep. Eleanor waited, counting the minutes, until Samuel's deep breathing indicated that he was asleep. Only then, with slow and careful movements, did she take the diary from its hiding place. By the tremulous light of a small candle she had kept for emergencies, she began to read. The first pages contained everyday notes, planting dates, weather conditions, hacienda accounts. But further on, the writing changed, becoming more personal, more urgent. May 15th, 1873. Today the surveyors arrived. They say they are measuring for the railroad, but Miguel saw them taking soil samples near the spring. There's something they're not telling us. June 3rd, 1873. The stranger appeared again, offering to buy our lands. When Matthias refused, his smile turned cold. "There are many ways to get what one wants," he said, before leaving. Elena turned the pages with trembling fingers. The story that unfolded was like a dark shadow that grew page by page. A family, the Valenzuelas, as she deduced from the initials and some mentions in the text, faced with powerful forces that coveted their lands. July 28th, 1873. We found silver veins in the cave under the big oak. Matthias wants to keep it secret. He fears that if it becomes known, we will lose everything. The medallion he forged with the first silver will be our talisman. Upon reading those words, Elena felt the air leave her lungs. Instinctively, her hand flew to the medallion hanging from her neck. The initials engraved on the reverse, which she had always assumed were her grandfather's. M.V. Matthias Valenzuela. The last entries were increasingly desperate, speaking of threats, of poisoned cattle, of a fire in the barn. And then a final notation written with trembling handwriting. October 10th, 1873. We can no longer resist. Tonight we will leave for the north, where my brother has a small farm. Perhaps someday we can return, reclaim what is rightfully ours. I leave this diary hidden with the hope that, if we don't return, someone will find the truth. Elena closed the book, feeling that the world had transformed beneath her feet. The scattered pieces of her identity began to fit into a pattern that she still couldn't fully comprehend. Was it possible that the Valenzuelas were her ancestors, that this town, this land, had some connection to her own history? Outside, the storm had almost completely ceased. Only a soft and persistent rain remained, pattering on the roof with a lulling rhythm. Elena put the diary back in its hiding place and lay down, knowing she wouldn't be able to sleep. Through the small window, the sky was beginning to clear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, renewed world. And with it, something had also changed inside Elena. A seed of truth had been planted, and now it only remained to wait for it to germinate. The morning after the storm brought with it a transformed world. The sky showed a blue almost painful in its purity, and the earth, normally dry and cracked, shone with ochre and reddish tones, as if the rain had awakened colors dormant for years. Eleanor went out early, eager to explore this reborn landscape. The air smelled of wet sage, moist earth, and that peculiar freshness that only exists after a great storm. Her boots sank slightly into the soft ground as she walked around the cabin, observing how small wildflowers, until then invisible, began to timidly poke their colorful heads out. Samuel had departed at dawn, mumbling something about checking for damage on the lands he watched over for an absent landowner. Before leaving, he had given precise instructions. Don't go too far. Don't cross the stream that now ran strongly. Return before noon. Elena nodded diligently, but inside her a different plan was bubbling. The words of the diary had been etched in her memory. We found silver veins in the cave under the big oak. She needed to find that. Please check if it still existed, if the story of the Valenzuelas was still alive in some corner of that land. Guided more by instinct than logic, she headed toward a gentle elevation of the terrain that could be distinguished in the distance. From there, she thought, she could have a panoramic view that would allow her to orient herself better. The path turned out to be more arduous than she had anticipated. The rain had converted some areas into small, treacherous mud pits, and she had to go around several sudden streams that cut the landscape like blue veins on the reddish skin of the earth. When she finally reached the top of the hill, the sun was already high in the sky. Elena stopped, panting slightly from the effort, and contemplated the panorama that stretched before her. The town seemed tiny in the distance, a handful of buildings clustered next to the silver ribbon of the main road. Beyond, the bluish mountains cut the horizon with their jagged profiles. But what captured her attention was a greenish glint in a hollow a few kilometers from where she stood. In the midst of the predominantly ochre landscape, that patch of vegetation seemed as out of place as a shout in a silent church. With renewed energy, Elena descended the hill and headed toward that unexpected oasis. As she approached, the sound of running water reached her ears, faint at first and then increasingly clear. Her heart was beating hard, not only from the physical effort, but from the growing certainty that she was about to discover something important. The vegetation became denser, bushes with leaves glistening from the recent rain, small, twisted but vital trees, and even some wildflowers formed a protective circle around what, upon approaching, Eleanor recognized as a spring. The water gushed between mossy rocks, forming a small crystalline pool before continuing its way downhill, where it probably joined one of the temporary streams. Eleanor knelt next to the pool, marveling at the purity of the water. Her reflection looked back at her, a still childish face but with eyes that had seen too much, framed by black hair that fell in unruly locks. Dipping her hands into the cold water, she drank eagerly, feeling how the pure liquid washed the dust from her throat and seemed to revitalize her from within. It was then that she saw it, a tree larger than the others, an ancient oak whose roots extended like gnarled fingers toward the spring. Its trunk, thick and twisted by the years, showed the scar of lightning or an ancient fire, but still stood proudly with its branches protectively extended over the water, the big oak from the diary. With quickened pulse, Eleanor began to explore the surroundings of the tree. She saw no entrance to a cave, but she remembered stories from her grandmother about how some sacred places only revealed themselves to those who knew how to look with the right eyes. Almost by instinct, she took the medallion from her neck and held it in the palm of her hand. The tree engraved in silver seemed to vibrate under the sunlight, as if recognizing its older brother standing before her. Elena approached the trunk of the oak and, following an impulse she couldn't explain, pressed the medallion against the rough bark. Nothing happened immediately, but as she went around the tree, her eyes caught something she had previously overlooked, a hollow at the base of the trunk, partially hidden by roots and low vegetation. Stooping, she pushed aside some branches and discovered that the hollow was bigger than it seemed, enough for a small person like her to slip inside. Darkness received her like a cool embrace. Her eyes took time to adapt, but when they did, she suppressed an exclamation of amazement. It wasn't simply a hollow in the tree, it was the entrance to a descending passage carved into the living rock. The walls, damp from water filtration, gleamed faintly, revealing mineral veins that trapped the little light filtering from the entrance. Elena advanced cautiously, guided by the walls. The passage descended in a gentle slope, gradually widening. The sound of water was increasingly strong, a constant murmur that seemed to call her. Finally, the passage led to a small but perfectly formed cavern. Light entered through fissures in the ceiling, creating golden beams that illuminated the scene as in a natural temple. In the center, a well of crystalline water reflected that light, multiplying it in flashes that danced on the walls. And on those walls, Elena saw what she was looking for, silver veins that ran through the stone like shining veins. Silver, the silver of the Valenzuelas. With trembling fingers, she touched one of the veins. The metal was cold and smooth under her fingers, contrasting with the roughness of the surrounding stone. How long had it been there, waiting? How many stories did it contain? Something on the floor of the cavern caught her attention, partially buried in the damp sand next to the a metallic object reflected one of the rays of light. Elena stooped and carefully unearthed it. It was a small tin box, corroded by time, but still intact. With her heart beating like a drum, she opened the box. Inside, she found a bundle of yellowish documents, carefully folded and protected by a piece of leather. On top of them, a medallion identical to hers, only this one had a different symbol engraved. Not a tree, but an 8-pointed star. Eleanor unfolded one of the documents. It was a property deed, dated 1850, that granted Matias Valenzuela and his descendants the rights to 400 acres of land, including the oak spring and all minerals found therein. Another document was a letter, written in hasty calligraphy. Dear Maria, if you are reading this, it means I couldn't return as I promised. Morton's men have found us. We barely have time to flee, but I have left this box for you, with the proof of our right to these lands and the twin medallion I forged for our unborn child. Someday, perhaps he or his children can claim what belongs to them. With all my love, Matias. Tears blurred Elena's vision. The date of the letter was October 1873, coinciding with the last entry in the diary. Matias Valenzuela, her great-grandfather, had written these words shortly before disappearing. And that unborn child, could it be her grandfather, her father's father? A noise of falling stones startled her. Someone was approaching through the passage. Quickly, she put the documents back in the box and hid it among her clothes. She had barely finished when a figure blocked the entrance to the cavern. I knew you would find this place, said Samuel, his silhouette outlined against the light of the passage. You carry his blood, after all. Eleanor looked at him, confused and alarmed at the same time. You knew who I am. Samuel advanced toward her, his face softened by the filtered light that filled the cave. Not at first, he replied. But when I saw your medallion, it's identical to the one Matias forged for his wife before everything crumbled. You knew Matias Valenzuela? Elena's voice trembled slightly. Samuel shook his head. No, but I knew his son. Your grandfather, I suppose. He told me the story, showed me the diary, made me promise to watch over these lands until some Valenzuela returned to claim them. He paused, his eyes fixed on the medallion Elena still held. And now you're here. Elena felt that an invisible circle was closing around her, connecting the past with the present, the dead with the living. Why didn't you tell me before? I had to be sure, Samuel replied, and you had to discover it for yourself. Some truths can't simply be told, they must be lived. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom of those words. She looked around once more, at the cave that held not only silver, but also the secrets of her family, the roots of her identity. What happened to them? To my great-grandparents? Samuel sighed, a sound that seemed to contain decades of sadness. That's a story for another time, he said, extending his hand to her. Now we must return. There are eyes in the valley that shouldn't know you found this place. At least not yet. Eleanor took his hand, feeling the calloused strength of those fingers that had guarded a secret for so long, patiently waiting for her to arrive. Together, they left the cavern toward the daylight, leaving behind the secret spring, but carrying with them its revelations. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains when they set out on the path back to the cabin. In the distance, the town seemed to sleep under the golden light of the afternoon, oblivious to the discovery that had just changed Elena's world forever. The harvest festival arrived with the first cool breath of autumn. Although the rain had been fleeting and the desert had soon returned to its usual state of vigilant dryness, the brief abundance of water had allowed the crops of the small farmers in the region to survive enough to justify a celebration. The town square had been transformed. Paper lanterns hung between the scrawny trees, their tremulous lights creating an almost magical atmosphere against the sky that was beginning to darken. Long tables covered with worn but clean tablecloths lined the perimeter, loaded with steaming stews, freshly made tortillas, and jugs of lemonade for the children, and something stronger for the adults. Eleanor observed everything. From the porch of Doña Carmela's store, where she helped to place trays of pumpkin and nut sweets that the old woman had prepared for the occasion. In the 3 months since her arrival in town, Eleanor had changed. Her cheeks, previously hollowed by hunger and tiredness, now showed a healthy color. Her hair, gathered in a careful braid, shone under the festive lights. And her eyes, although they still reflected an inner age much older, now contained sparks of something that looked very much like happiness. "You're very quiet, child," Doña Carmela commented, adjusting the embroidered shawl she only wore on special occasions. "Is something worrying you?" Elena shook her head, but the truth was more complex. Since the discovery of the cave and the documents, a restlessness had settled inside her. Samuel had told her fragments of the family history, confirming what she already suspected. She was a direct descendant of Matias Valenzuela, the man who had discovered the silver and whose lands had been forcibly usurped. "I'm just thinking," she finally replied. Doña Carmela observed her with those perceptive eyes that seemed to read beyond words. "Thinking too much on festive days is bad medicine," she said, giving her a pat on the shoulder. "Go, enjoy. The music is about to begin." As if her words had been a signal, the first chords of a violin tore through the night air, soon accompanied by a guitar and the muffled rhythm of a small drum. People began to congregate in the center of the square, forming a circle around the musicians. Elena mingled with the crowd, letting herself be carried by the current of bodies and laughter. The neighbors who had previously looked at her with suspicion now greeted her as she passed, some even with genuine affection. Her work in the store and her silent but efficient way of solving problems had earned her a place in that hermetic community. The dance began spontaneously when a middle-aged man took his wife to the center of the circle. Soon other couples joined in, spinning to the rhythm of a melody that seemed to arise from the earth itself, ancient and new at the same time. Elena was watching, fascinated, when she felt a presence beside her. Upon turning, she found Samuel. He wore a clean shirt, and his face, normally somber, seemed more relaxed under the light of the lanterns. "I didn't think you would come," she said, genuinely surprised. Samuel rarely participated in community events. "Some traditions deserve to be honored," he replied with a distant look, as if he saw beyond the current celebration, toward forgotten festivals of his own past. They remained in silence, shoulder to shoulder, observing the dance. Eleanor felt a strange connection with that taciturn man who had guarded the secrets of her family for so long. It wasn't the easy and luminous affection that develops between people without wounds. It was something deeper, forged in the mutual understanding of pain and loss. The music changed to a slower, almost nostalgic melody. The violinist, an older man with gnarled but agile hands, closed his eyes as he played, as if the music flowed directly from his soul without need for intermediaries. "My father played like that," Samuel commented in a voice so low that Elena barely heard it above the music. On nights like this, it seemed he could make the stars sing. It was the first time Samuel had voluntarily mentioned his father, and Elena instinctively knew she should receive that confidence for what it was, a precious and fragile gift. "My grandmother used to sing," she responded, offering in exchange a piece of her own past. "Songs in a language that almost no one speaks anymore. She said that as long as we sang them, our ancestors would remain alive." Samuel nodded, understanding. His gaze scanned the square until it stopped at a specific point. Elena followed the direction of his eyes and saw a group of men gathered at a separate table. One of them, dressed more elegantly than the rest, immediately caught her attention. Tall, with graying hair combed back and a thin, well-kept mustache, he emanated an aura of authority that seemed to demand deference. "Morton," said Samuel, with an inflection that turned the name into something poisonous. Or rather, his son. He inherited the empire his father built on stolen lands. Eleanor felt a shiver. Morton, the surname mentioned in the letter she had found in the cave, the man who had pursued her. Great-grandparents. He owns half the valley now, Samuel continued, including the lands where you found the spring. My lands, Elena murmured, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. Samuel looked at her, a spark of approval in his normally impassive eyes. Yes, your lands, but he doesn't know it. He believes the Valenzuelas disappeared forever and that the original documents were lost in the fire his men started. What happened to them? To my great-grandparents, I mean, asked Eleanor, knowing that it was time to hear the complete story. Samuel sighed, passing a hand over his tired face. They fled north, as the diary said. Maria was pregnant. They arrived at a mining town where no one asked too many questions and changed their surname to Vargas. He paused, as if ordering ancient memories. Matias worked in the mines until a cave-in took him. Maria raised her son, your grandfather, alone, telling him stories about the lands they should someday recover. Elena felt that. Tears threatened to overflow, but she contained them. This was not the time to cry for ghosts. How do you know all this? Your grandfather returned here when he was young, looking for the lands from his mother's stories. We met then. Samuel looked toward the starry sky. We were friends. He found the original documents his father had hidden in the cave, but before he could present his claim, there were problems. He had to leave again, leaving me in charge of watching over the lands until a Valenzuela returned. What kind of problems? Elena insisted. That's another story for another night. At that moment, the music stopped abruptly. A murmur ran through the crowd when Morton's son stood up and advanced toward the center of the square. He was the very image of confidence, of power that needs no justification. Friends, his voice, educated but with a hint of condescension, spread over the crowd. It's a pleasure to be among you tonight. As you know, my family has been part of this community for generations. Elena listened to the speech with a knot in her throat. Each word seemed a mockery of the truth she now knew, of the injustice that had shaped her destiny long before her birth. And that's why I have the honor of announcing that the railroad will finally reach our valley next year, continued Morton Jr., with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Progress has knocked at our door, and we must be prepared to receive it. Scattered applause and murmurs of approval followed the announcement. For many in town, the railroad meant the promise of prosperity, of connection with a wider world. The main station will be built on land generously donated by my family, added Morton, specifically in the area of the Oak Spring, which will be channeled to supply both the railroad and the town. Eleanor felt the ground wobble beneath her feet. The spring, her spring, the cave with the silver of her ancestors, everything would be lost if she allowed those plans to proceed. Samuel must have sensed her distress, because his hand found Elena's and squeezed it briefly, a gesture of solidarity and also of warning. It was not the time to reveal herself. The music began to play again, but the carefree joy of before had evaporated. Elena observed how Morton Jr. accepted congratulations and pats on the back, his practiced smile shining under the festive lights. How much did he really know? Was he aware that his wealth was based on theft, or had he simply inherited a lie so old that it had already become truth? We should leave, Samuel murmured. The night has eyes and ears. Elena nodded, but before leaving, her eyes briefly met Morton's. It was a fleeting instant, but something in the girl's gaze, a fierce determination that didn't correspond to her age, seemed to disconcert the man. He frowned slightly, as if trying to remember where he had seen those dark, deep eyes before. They made the path back to the cabin in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts. The stars shone coldly over the desert, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding under their ancestral light. That night, while Samuel slept, Eleanor took out the documents she had found in the cave and studied them by the trembling light of a candle. Tracing with her fingers the signatures of her ancestors gave her a strange sensation of continuity, as if through those lines of faded ink she could touch the hands that had written them. In the middle of the quiet night, with the silver medallion faintly shining on her chest, Eleanor made a decision. She would not be a passive spectator of her own history. The Valenzuelas had been stripped of their legacy once, but she would not allow it to happen again. Outside, the desert wind whispered among the dried shrubs, carrying with it echoes of ancient promises and recent decisions. The announcement about the railroad caused an immediate stir in the small community, where before there had been resignation and a routine dictated by the immutable rhythm of the desert. Expectation now boiled. New faces began to appear in town, engineers with their shiny instruments, investors in impeccable suits, rough workers who installed a provisional camp on the outskirts. Elena observed these changes from the counter of Doña Carmela's store, which had never been so busy. Foreigners bought provisions, locals acquired new fabrics to make their best attire, and money, that infrequent visitor to the town, now seemed to flow with the same generosity as water after the storm. "You seem worried, child," Doña Carmela commented one afternoon as they arranged a new shipment of preserves. "Anyone would say you should be happy with all this activity." Elena shrugged, not knowing how to explain the constant knot she felt in her stomach. In the weeks since the harvest festival, she had jealously guarded her secret, even from Doña Carmela. Samuel had advised caution, and although youthful impatience was eating away at her, she recognized the wisdom of his words. "It's too much noise," she finally replied. "Too many strangers." Doña Carmela nodded understandingly. "Progress always brings with it a certain chaos," she said, with the wisdom of one who has seen too many cycles of hope and disappointment. "But this town needs new blood, or it will dry up like a plant without water." Elena was about to respond when the bell on the door announced the entrance of a customer. Upon turning, she felt her heart skip a beat. There, examining the shelves with educated curiosity, was Morton Jr. Up close, he seemed even more formidable, tall, impeccably dressed, with that presence that only the privilege of several generations bestows. "Mrs. Suarez," he greeted with a nod. "What a pleasure to find you in such good health." Doña Carmela returned the greeting with a stiffness that contradicted her kind words. "Mr. Morton, what brings you to my humble establishment?" Morton ran his gaze over the store, pausing briefly on Elena before focusing again on Doña Carmela. "I was passing by and thought of visiting an old family friend." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "My father always held your late husband in high esteem." A tense silence followed these words. Elena perceived that there was history there, old wounds that had never completely healed. "What can I offer you?" asked Doña Carmela, taking refuge in commercial courtesy. "Actually," Morton approached the counter, his expensive cologne uncomfortably mixing with the smells of coffee and spices in the store, "I came to extend an invitation. As you know, we are organizing a reception for the railroad investors. It would be an honor to have your presence. You are, after all, an institution in this town." Doña Carmela seemed surprised, but quickly composed herself. "You are very kind, but my days of parties were left behind a long time ago." Morton insisted with that elegant tenacity of one accustomed to his wishes being orders. "I insist. It will be something simple at my hacienda. This Saturday at dusk." His gaze fell again on Elena. "And your little helper is also invited, of course. It's always refreshing to have youth at these events." Before Doña Carmela could decline again, Morton was already heading to the door. "I'll expect you on Saturday," he said, as if the matter were settled. "Ah, and please, extend the invitation to Mr. Torres. I understand he is now the guardian of the little one." The door closed behind him, but his presence seemed to remain in the store like a persistent and unpleasant odor. "Samuel Torres?" asked Elena, surprised that Morton knew about her relationship with the taciturn cowboy. Doña Carmela sighed, sitting heavily in the chair behind the counter. "In a small town everything is eventually known," she said, passing a hand over her tired face, "and Morton has eyes and ears everywhere." "Why would he invite us?" asked Elena, unable to hide her distrust. The old woman looked at her for a long time before responding. "Men like Morton do nothing without a purpose. Perhaps he just wants to show his generosity to the investors, inviting the less fortunate." She paused. "Or perhaps he's more interested in you and Samuel than he appears." A shiver ran down Elena's back. Could it be possible that Morton suspected something? That he knew the connection between her and the lands his family had usurped? That night, in the cabin, Samuel received the news of the invitation with a prolonged silence. He was sitting on the porch, carving a figure in wood with his knife, an activity he had adopted on quiet afternoons. His hands, large and weathered, moved with surprising delicacy, revealing forms that seemed to already exist inside the wood, waiting to be freed. "We'll go," he finally said to Elena's surprise. Why? She asked, sitting on the porch step, hugging her knees against her chest. That man. His family stole everything from mine. Samuel put his carving aside and looked at her directly, something rare for him. Sometimes it's better to keep your enemies where you can see them, he replied. Besides, his hacienda is built on part of the Valenzuela lands. You could see what should have been yours. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the logic of his reasoning, although a part of her rebelled at the idea of shaking hands with the man whose family had destroyed hers. The following days passed in a state of nervous anticipation. Doña Carmela, after overcoming her initial reluctance, seemed to become enthusiastic about the idea of the reception. She took out a dress that had belonged to her daughter from the bottom of a chest and adapted it for Elena, working late with her arthritic but precise hands. I want you to shine that night, she said, as she sewed delicate lace on the collar of the dress, for everyone to see that you're not just any girl. Saturday arrived with a relentless clarity. The sky was a perfect blue, without a single cloud offering hope of rain or shade. Samuel appeared at the store at dusk, wearing a clean shirt and a vest that Elena had never seen him wear before. He had cut his hair and trimmed his beard, and although he still had the look of a man who preferred the solitude of the desert to human company, there was an undeniable dignity about him. Doña Carmela was waiting for them, elegant in a black dress with a lace shawl. The three formed a strange group: the elderly shopkeeper, the solitary cowboy, and the girl with the mysterious past. And yet, as they climbed into the carriage that Morton had sent to pick them up, Elena felt a current of affection so intense that for a moment she found it difficult to breathe. These two taciturn and wounded adults had somehow improbably become her family. The Morton hacienda emerged on the horizon like an apparition. In the midst of the arid landscape, its green, well-kept gardens seemed an insult to the very nature of the desert. Water, Elena understood with a pang of anger. Water from the spring that belonged to her family, diverted to create this artificial oasis. The carriage traversed an avenue flanked by trees brought from distant lands until it stopped in front of a colonial-style mansion with white columns and wide galleries. Uniformed servants received them, leading the guests to the back garden, where the reception was already underway. Eleanor had never seen such a display of luxury. Tables covered with white, linen tablecloths, fine porcelain dinnerware, silver candelabras and centerpieces with flowers that must have been brought from far away. The guests, mostly businessmen and their wives, dressed with an elegance that made even Eleanor's carefully prepared outfit seem provincial. Morton received them with the calculated effusiveness of an experienced host. "Doña Carmela, what a pleasure that you could come." He kissed the hand of the old woman with a gallantry that she received with an imperturbable expression. "And Mr. Torres, I almost don't recognize you without your usual hat." He shook Samuel's hand firmly. "And this must be little Elena. I've heard a lot about you, young lady." Elena made a small curtsy, as Doña Carmela had taught her, but kept her eyes fixed on Morton's. There was something in his gaze, an almost scientific curiosity, that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "Please, enjoy the evening," Morton continued. "Make yourselves at home. After all," he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "this land has welcomed many families over the years." As Morton walked away to receive other guests, Samuel leaned slightly toward Eleanor. "Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut," he murmured. "Learn everything you can." Elena nodded, understanding. This visit wasn't social, it was a reconnaissance mission in enemy territory. The evening progressed amidst polite conversations and music, from a small ensemble playing classical pieces from a corner of the garden. Elena moved discreetly among the guests, listening to fragments of conversations, observing interactions. She caught mentions of the railroad, of new developments, of the mineral wealth of the valley that would soon be exploited, as it should be. At one point she found herself next to an ornamental fountain. The water flowed crystalline, forming bright arcs under the light of the oil lamps. Elena couldn't help but think of the oak spring, how its water, wild and pure, had been domesticated and reduced to this spectacle of vanity. Her reflection in the undulating surface of the water returned a serious, almost adult gaze. The dress adapted by Doña Carmela suited her well, highlighting the transition from girl to woman that was beginning to take place in her, but her eyes remained the same, dark, deep, laden with a history that was much older than her scant years. It's curious how water always shows us what we are, not what we pretend to be. The voice, soft but firm, startled her. Upon turning, she found herself facing an elegant woman, about 40 years old, with a face that combined classical beauty and an intelligence evident in her clear eyes. "I'm Isabel Morton," the woman introduced herself, "the wife of our host." Eleanor made another curtsy, trying to hide her surprise. She hadn't expected Mrs. Morton to notice her, much less to address her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am," she replied, with the courtesy that Doña Carmela had instilled in her. Isabel Morton studied her with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "There's something about you that seems familiar to me," she said, more to herself than to Elena. "Like an echo of something I've seen before, or perhaps dreamed." Elena felt her heart accelerate. Could it be possible that this woman recognized features of the Valenzuelas in her? Had she perhaps seen old portraits of the family whose lands she now owned? "You probably mistake me for someone else, ma'am," she replied, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Isabel smiled, a gesture that transformed her face, making it younger and more accessible. "Perhaps," she conceded. "Memory plays strange tricks, especially on nights like this." She made a gesture encompassing the illuminated garden. "All this, sometimes I wonder if it really belongs to us, or if we are just temporary custodians of something greater than ourselves." There was a melancholy in her voice that disconcerted Elena. This wasn't the arrogant wife of a usurper that she had imagined, but a woman with her own complexities and apparently her own doubts. Before she could respond, Morton appeared next to his wife, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. "I see you've met our young guest," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elena is quite a celebrity in our little town. She has conquered the heart of Doña Carmela, which is no small feat." Isabel nodded, without taking her eyes off Elena. "She has a special air," she commented, "as if she belonged to this place in a way that the rest of us don't." Morton laughed, a calculated sound that made Elena's skin crawl. "My dear, always so poetic," he said, with a hint of condescension. "Elena is simply a fortunate girl who found good protectors after— What was your story, little one? Your parents abandoned you during the drought." The casual cruelty of the question hit Elena like a physical slap. She felt the blood leave her face, but before she could respond, another voice intervened. "Elena's story is hers to tell when and if she wishes," said Samuel, who had materialized beside her like a protective shadow. "Not all of us exhibit our wounds as dinner entertainment, Mr. Morton." A tense silence followed these words. Morton looked at Samuel with an expression that fluctuated between surprise and something darker, more primitive. For an instant, the mask of civilization seemed to slip, revealing the predator lurking underneath. "Of course," he finally said, recovering his practiced smile. "I didn't mean to offend, I just thought our young guest might want to share her fascinating story." Isabel Morton observed the exchange with an indecipherable expression. "We should return to our other guests, dear," she said, gently taking her husband's arm. "It's been a pleasure meeting you, Elena. I hope our paths cross again." As the couple walked away, Elena felt her legs trembling. The tension of the encounter, Morton's cruel insinuation about her abandonment, the strange connection she had felt with Isabel, everything mixed in a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Samuel remained at her side, his silent presence offering an anchor in the midst of the inner storm. "Breathe deeply," he murmured. "Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you affected." Elena nodded, gradually regaining her composure. At that moment, she made a decision. No matter the cost or the time it took, she would recover what rightfully belonged to her, not just for herself, but for all the Valenzuelas who had been stripped of their legacy. "I want to leave," she finally said. Samuel nodded. "I'll look for Doña Carmela." As she waited, Elena looked at her reflection in the fountain again. The water, now agitated by a night breeze, distorted her image, fragmenting it into 1,000 pieces that then came back together. Like her identity, she thought, fractured but persistent, resisting disappearance despite all. Attempts to erase it. At the bottom of the fountain, something caught her attention. A silver coin, perhaps thrown as a wish or simply forgotten. The light from the lamps made it shine like a star fallen from the sky. Without thinking too much, Eleanor extended her hand and took the coin. It was ancient, its surface worn by time and water. As she turned it between her fingers, she felt a shiver of recognition. On one of its faces, barely visible, was engraved a tree with deep roots, just like her. Medallion. She put the coin in the pocket of her dress just as Samuel returned with Doña Carmela. As they said goodbye to their host with forced courtesy and climbed back into the carriage, Elena felt the weight of the coin against her chest, like a palpitating secret, a promise of truths to discover. The night was clear and cold when they left the Morton hacienda. In the sky, the stars seemed to observe them with the infinite patience of those who have witnessed countless cycles of injustice and redemption. Elena now knew with a certainty that went beyond reason that her arrival in this town had not been coincidental. It was destiny, or perhaps something older and more powerful, that had guided her here, to this moment, to this inevitable confrontation with the past. As the carriage advanced along the dusty road, her fingers caressed the contour of the rescued coin, a fragment of history, a silent witness, another piece in the puzzle of her heritage. Winter arrived in the valley with unusual severity. It wasn't the intense cold of the mountains, but a dry, cutting coldness that slipped under doors and between the poorly fitted boards of the humblest houses. Mornings dawned, covered by a thin layer of frost that the sun voraciously devoured as it ascended, but which formed again stubborn with each nightfall. Eleanor had developed a new routine since the visit to the Morton hacienda. Each afternoon, after finishing her work at the store, she headed to the municipal library, a small but surprisingly well-stocked space thanks to donations from some well-off families. There, under the benevolent gaze of the librarian, an older man with thick glasses and trembling hands, she immersed herself in old local newspapers, yellowed maps, and property records. She was looking for traces of the Valenzuelas, any mention that could strengthen her claim to the lands. Samuel had warned her to proceed with caution, not to reveal the true purpose of her investigations, and she had followed his advice to the letter, presenting her interest as a school project on local history. That late January afternoon, as Elena carefully copied dates and names into a notebook that Doña Carmela had given her, the bell on the library door announced the arrival of a new visitor. Without raising her eyes from her work, Elena heard the murmur of voices, the librarian greeting with deference, a female response, soft footsteps approaching her table. Only when a shadow fell on her notes did Elena look up. Before her, wrapped in an elegantly cut coat, was Isabel Morton. "Good afternoon, Elena," greeted the woman, with that soft but firm voice she remembered from the reception. "Mr. Garcia told me I might find you here." Elena stood up hurriedly, closing her notebook with a movement she hoped didn't seem too defensive. "Mrs. Morton," she replied, slightly inclining her head. "It's a surprise to see you here." Isabel smiled, a gesture that softened the aristocratic features of her face. "I can imagine. I don't usually visit the town frequently." She paused, her eyes briefly resting on the closed notebook. "Am I interrupting you?" "Not at all," Eleanor lied. "I had already finished for today." Isabel seemed satisfied with the response. With a fluid gesture, she took a seat in the chair across from Eleanor, who, after a moment of hesitation, sat down again. "I kept thinking about you after the reception," Isabel confessed, speaking in a low voice out of respect for the silence of the library. "There's something about you that seemed familiar to me, like an echo of something I know but can't name." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her back. The coin she had found in the Morton fountain, and which she now carried along with her medallion, seemed to burn against her skin. "Perhaps you mistake me for someone else," she replied, repeating the same words she had used in their first encounter. Isabel shook her head, an elegant but decided gesture. "No, it's something deeper." Her eyes, of an intense blue that contrasted with her brown hair, studied Elena's face with a disconcerting intensity. "When I was a child, my grandmother had an old portrait of a family that, according to her, had owned these lands before us. The woman in the portrait had your same eyes." Elena's heart took a painful leap. A portrait of the Valenzuelas? In the possession of the Mortons? The irony was almost unbearable. "Coincidences exist," she said, struggling to maintain a carefree tone. "I suppose so," Isabel conceded, although she didn't seem convinced. "In any case, I haven't come just out of curiosity. I have a proposal for you." Eleanor waited, suddenly alert. Any proposal coming from a Morton should be considered with extreme caution. "My husband mentioned that you have a talent for numbers and organization," Isabel continued. And I need help with the hacienda records, account books, correspondence, that sort of thing. She paused. I'm offering you a job, 3 days a week. The pay would be considerably better than what you receive at Doña Carmela's store. The proposal was so unexpected that for a moment Elena didn't know how to respond. Work at the Morton hacienda, in the house built on land stolen from her family? The idea provoked contradictory feelings in her, repulsion at the idea of serving those who had dispossessed her own, but also a spark of hope. Having access to the hacienda, to its archives, could provide her with valuable information. It's very kind. "Of you, Mrs. Morton," she finally replied, "but I have commitments to Doña Carmela." "I've already spoken with her," Isabel interrupted, with a smile that revealed how accustomed she was to having her wishes fulfilled. "She agrees to do without you 3 days a week. In fact, she seemed quite pleased with the idea." Elena tried to hide her surprise. Had Doña Carmela agreed to this without consulting her? The betrayal, though small, hurt. "I would have to talk about it with Samuel as well," she said, trying to buy time. "Of course," Isabel nodded. "Take the time you need to decide. But I must confess," she added, in a tone that descended to become almost a whisper, "that I would love to have you at the hacienda. There's something in your presence that brings life to that place." There was a melancholy in her words that disconcerted Elena. Isabel Morton, with all her wealth and privilege, seemed genuinely lonely. "I'll think about it," Elena promised. "Excellent," Isabel rose with the fluid grace of one who has been educated to move in the most refined circles. "I'll send a carriage Monday morning, if you decide to accept." She extended a gloved hand toward Elena. "Until soon, I hope." Elena briefly shook the offered hand, feeling through the delicate glove the fragility of those fingers. For an instant she saw Isabel Morton, not as the wife of the usurper, but as a woman trapped in circumstances that she might not have completely chosen. When the library door closed, behind Isabel's elegant figure, Elena sat down again, feeling that her legs had lost all strength. The job offer was an unexpected complication, a detour in the path she had carefully traced during the past months. That night in the cabin, Samuel listened to her account with a furrowed brow. He was carving again, his weathered fingers giving shape to the wood with patient precision. The figure, Elena noticed, was beginning to resemble a tree, its branches extending toward an invisible sky. "It's a trap," he finally said without raising his eyes from his work. "They want you close to watch you." "But why?" asked Elena, frustrated. "What could I know that would worry them? I haven't said anything about the Valenzuelas, about the documents." "Old Morton was a shrewd and paranoid man," Samuel explained. "He knew he had stolen those lands and lived fearing that someday the true owners would return to claim them." He paused, his eyes getting lost in memories he never completely shared. His son inherited that paranoia, although he disguises it better under layers of education and good manners. Elena reflected on these words, remembering Morton Jr.'s penetrating gaze during the reception, the way he had studied her, as one examines a potential threat. "But what about Mrs. Morton?" she asked. "She seems different." Samuel sighed, resuming his carving with slower, almost meditative movements. "Isabel Morton wasn't born into this family," he replied. "She came from the East Coast, from a good family fallen on hard times. A marriage of convenience, they say. Perhaps she doesn't share the sins of the Mortons, but she hasn't done anything to amend them either." A contemplative silence settled between them. Outside, the desert wind murmured among the dry shrubs, bringing with it the cold and mineral aroma of the winter night. "I think I should accept," Elena finally said, with a determination that surprised even herself. "I could learn things, find evidence, be close to the enemy to know their plans." Samuel looked at her for a long time, with an expression that mixed concern and reluctant pride. "It's dangerous," he said at last, "if they discover who you really are." "I'll be careful," Elena promised. "No one will suspect that an orphaned girl could be a threat to them." Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. Underestimation was, perhaps, Elena's greatest advantage. "All right," he finally conceded, "but you must tell me. Everything you see and hear there. Everything." Elena nodded solemnly. That night, before sleeping, she took out the coin she had taken from the fountain and studied it by the dim light of a candle. The tree engraved on its surface, almost erased by time and water, seemed to pulsate with its own life. She brought it close to her medallion. They were identical, two pieces separated from the same whole. With her head full of unanswered questions and her heart divided between fear and determination, Elena finally fell asleep. In her dreams, she walked through the hallways of a large, silent house, looking for something she couldn't name, while a familiar voice called her from rooms she could never reach. The Morton carriage arrived punctually on Monday morning. The driver, a man with an impassive face and few words, barely nodded when Elena got into the vehicle, wrapped in the thickest shawl that Doña Carmela had lent her to protect herself from the cutting cold of January. The journey to the hacienda proceeded in silence. Elena observed the landscape through the small window, noting how the vegetation gradually became more abundant as they approached the Morton lands, artificially irrigated with water diverted from the oak spring. The injustice of this contrast caused a knot in her throat, dryness and struggle for the inhabitants of the town, greenery and abundance for those who had stolen what didn't belong to them. The hacienda presented a different aspect in the morning light. Without the lamps and decorations of the party, it was easier to appreciate the solidity of its construction, the permanence that its owners had sought to impose on a hostile territory. The white columns, the large windows, the carefully designed gardens, everything spoke of a power that believed itself invulnerable to time and circumstances. Isabel Morton was waiting for her on the main porch, elegant even in the relative simplicity of her morning dress. Her smile, upon seeing Elena descend from the carriage, seemed genuinely pleased. "You've come," she said, extending both hands toward her. "You don't know how happy that makes me." Elena returned the greeting with a polite curtsy, maintaining the emotional distance that Samuel had advised. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Morton," she replied, with the practiced formality she had learned from Doña Carmela. Isabel led her into the house, through a vestibule with high ceilings where footsteps resonated on the polished marble. Elena couldn't help but marvel at the sober but undeniable luxury that surrounded her: furniture of noble woods, imported tapestries, paintings in golden frames. Everything spoke of generations of accumulated wealth, of privileges that she could only imagine. "I'll show you where you'll work," said Isabel, guiding her down a side hallway away from the main rooms. "It's my personal office. My husband has his own study for hacienda matters, but I maintain the social, correspondence and domestic records." She opened a carved wooden door that led to a bright and surprisingly cozy room. Large windows let in the winter light, illuminating bookshelves full of books, an oak desk with elaborate drawers, and a small sofa upholstered in a deep blue tone. The aroma of beeswax and old paper permeated the air. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said sincerely, momentarily forgetting her wariness. Isabel smiled, pleased by her reaction. "It was my mother-in-law's favorite room," she explained. "When she died 5 years ago, I decided to convert it into my personal refuge." She gestured toward the desk. "There you'll find the domestic account books. I need you to organize the expenses by categories: maintenance, personnel, food, and so on. Then there's the correspondence." As Isabel explained the tasks, Elena discreetly scanned the room with her gaze, registering details. The titles of the books, mostly novels and poetry, small personal objects that suggested refined tastes, and especially a small portrait placed on a side table. She approached it when Isabel was distracted, looking for something in a drawer. The painting showed a young woman with delicate features, dressed according to the fashion of at least 30 years ago, with a medallion visible on her chest. Elena held her breath. It was identical to hers. "My mother-in-law, Constanza," said Isabel, surprising her. "A fascinating woman, they say. She died before I arrived at this house, but her presence is still tangible." Elena nodded, trying to hide her perturbation. Why did Morton's mother wear a Valenzuela medallion? The pieces didn't fit. "Well, I'll let you work," Isabel continued. "If you need anything, Rosario, the housekeeper, will be at the end of the hallway. I must go out to supervise some matters in the greenhouse, but I'll return for lunchtime." When Isabel left, gently closing the door behind her, Elena remained motionless for several seconds, absorbing the silence of the room. Then, moving cautiously, she began to explore in more detail. The account books were exactly what Isabel had described: meticulous records of domestic expenses, written in an elegant handwriting that she assumed belonged to Mrs. Morton. But Eleanor was looking for something more. Carefully, she opened the desk drawers, finding writing materials, apparently innocuous documents, social correspondence. It was in the last drawer, half hidden by folders of invoices, where she found something interesting. A diary bound in red leather. The temptation to open it was immense, but Elena knew she didn't have the time necessary to read it without the risk of being discovered. With a sigh of frustration, she returned to her assigned task, deciding she would look for a safer opportunity. The hours passed with surprising rapidity as Elena methodically organized the financial records. She discovered she had a natural talent for this type of work. Her mind caught patterns, detected anomalies, established connections between seemingly unconnected data. By mid-morning, she had created a more efficient system than the one she had found, categorizing expenses in a way that revealed information about the internal functioning of the hacienda. The door opened without warning, startling her, but it wasn't Isabel who entered, but Morton Jr. His expression, upon seeing her sitting behind his wife's desk, was one of poorly disguised surprise. "Well," he said, with that educated but cold voice that Elena remembered. "I didn't know Isabel had hired help." Elena stood up, making a small curtsy. "Good morning, Mr. Morton," she said, maintaining a neutral tone. "Mrs. Morton asked me to organize some records." Morton advanced toward the desk, examining the work that Elena had done. His eyes, grey like steel, ran over the neatly noted columns of numbers. "Impressive," he conceded, though without true enthusiasm. "Where is my wife?" "In the greenhouse, sir. She said she would return." "For lunch?" Morton nodded distractedly, his attention now fixed on Elena. He studied her with that same disturbing intensity he had shown during the reception, as if trying to solve a particularly difficult enigma. "There's something about you," he finally said with a frankness that disarmed her. "Something familiar that I can't identify." Eleanor felt her heart accelerate, but maintained an impassive expression. "Perhaps you confuse me with someone else, sir," she replied, repeating the same words she had used with Isabel. Morton smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps," he conceded, "or perhaps you're exactly who I think you are." Before Eleanor could respond to this cryptic assertion, Isabel returned, her face flushed from the outdoor cold. Upon seeing her husband, she seemed momentarily surprised. "Richard, I didn't expect you until dinner." "I finished my business in town earlier than expected," he replied, his tone subtly changing, becoming softer though no less. "Calculated. I see you found a very capable assistant." Isabel smiled, positioning herself next to Elena in a gesture that seemed almost protective. "Elena has a natural talent for order. Exactly what I needed." Morton nodded, directing one last evaluative look toward Elena before turning to the door. "Don't monopolize her too much, dear," he said, with a lightness that sounded rehearsed. "Doña Carmela might accuse us of stealing her best employee." When the door closed behind him, Elena noticed that Isabel exhaled an almost imperceptible sigh. "My husband can be intense," she said with a smile that didn't entirely hide a certain tension. "Don't let him intimidate you." Elena nodded, although she felt that something important had happened in that brief encounter, something she couldn't yet fully decipher. Lunch took place in the small family dining room, only with Isabel, since Morton had returned to his affairs. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Isabel had the gift of asking questions that seemed to arise from genuine interest, not mere courtesy, and Elena found herself sharing details of her life in Doña Carmela's store, her discoveries in the library, her fondness for music. "Do you play any instrument?" asked Isabel, while a maid removed the dessert plates. "A little piano," Elena replied. "Doña Carmela allows me to practice on hers." Isabel's face lit up. "We have a magnificent piano in the music room," she said. "It was my mother-in-law's. No one has played it since her death." She paused, as if considering something. "Would you like to see it?" Elena nodded, genuinely interested. Isabel led her through several hallways to a circular room located in one of the side wings of the house. Upon opening the doors, Eleanor suppressed an exclamation of amazement. The music room was a space of ethereal beauty. Tall windows let in light filtered by gauze curtains, creating a dreamlike atmosphere. In the center, on a circular platform, rested a black grand piano, its shiny surface reflecting light like an obsidian mirror. Eleanor couldn't find words. "I know," Isabel smiled. "It has that effect on everyone who sees it for the first time." They approached the instrument. Isabel lifted the lid with a reverent gesture, revealing yellowish ivory keys that spoke of years without use. "Would you play something for me?" she asked, with a voice that contained an almost childlike longing. Elena hesitated. Playing for Doña Carmela in the privacy of the attic was one thing. Doing it here, in this house that represented everything that had been stolen from her family, was quite another. But there was something in Isabel's expression, a poorly disguised loneliness, that moved her. "I only know simple melodies," she warned, sitting on the bench. "Simplicity has its own beauty," Isabel replied, settling into a nearby armchair. Elena placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the smoothness of the ivory under her fingertips. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting muscle memory guide her movements. The melody that emerged was the same lullaby she had played for Doña Carmela, but this time her fingers found new nuances, as if the instrument itself whispered secrets to her. Upon finishing, she opened her eyes to find Isabel observing her with an indecipherable expression, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, almost painful. "That song," Isabel murmured. "It's so familiar." "It's an ancient song," Elena explained. "My grandmother taught it to me. She said her mother sang it and her mother's mother before her." Isabel nodded slowly, as if each word from Elena confirmed something she already suspected. "Richard's mother, Constanza, used to hum a very similar melody while embroidering," she said with a distant voice. "I never knew where she had learned it." A silence laden with unformulated questions settled between them. Elena felt they were on the verge of an important revelation, but neither seemed willing to take the final step toward that sensed truth. The clock in the room struck 3, breaking the spell of the moment. "I must return to the office," said Elena, standing up from the bench. Isabel nodded, recovering her usual composure. "Of course. You've worked hard today." She stood as well, smoothing her dress with an automatic gesture. "The carriage will take you back to town at 5. The remaining hours passed in a state of intense concentration. Elena finished organizing the financial records of the previous month and began with the correspondence, methodically classifying it. But her mind worked on another level, processing the revelations of the day, the portrait with the medallion, Morton's reaction, the song that Isabel recognized. When the time came to leave, Isabel accompanied her to the carriage. "You've done excellent work," she said, handing her an envelope. "I expect you on Wednesday." Elena thanked her with a curtsy and got into the vehicle. Only when the carriage passed through the gates of the hacienda did she allow herself to open the envelope. It contained not only the promised payment, but also a note written in Isabel's elegant handwriting. "Music awakens memories that the mind has forgotten, but the heart preserves. Thank you for bringing that melody back to this house." During the return journey, as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, Elena contemplated the landscape with new eyes. The Morton hacienda was no longer simply the symbol of the usurpation of her heritage. It had become a terrain of mysteries to decipher, of hidden connections waiting to be revealed. In her mind, like an underground river, flowed the certainty that there was much more to the story of the Mortons and Valenzuelas than Samuel had told her, and she was determined to discover the truth, however painful or surprising it might be. The carriage advanced along the dusty road, moving away from the artificial wealth of the hacienda, and, approaching the austere authenticity of the town, Elena felt she was suspended between two worlds, between two truths, between two identities, and in that suspension, in that liminal space, perhaps resided the key to everything. February brought treacherous winds that raised dust devils and dragged clouds laden with unfulfilled promises. They were dense, dark clouds that passed over the valley, projecting momentary shadows, but which never discharged their precious cargo of water, as if the sky itself wanted to mock the thirst of the earth. Elena had established a routine that divided her week between Doña Carmela's store, the Morton hacienda, and afternoons of research in the library. Samuel observed her comings and goings with a worried expression, but respected her determination. Each night, sitting in front of the small stove that combated the night cold, Elena related her discoveries, her impressions, the conversations she had heard. "There's something that doesn't fit," she said. One of those nights, while they shared a simple dinner of beans and tortillas, "Mrs. Morton has a portrait of her mother-in-law wearing a medallion like mine, and she recognized my grandmother's song." Samuel chewed slowly, his face impassive except for a slight furrowing of his brow. It could be coincidence, he suggested without conviction. There are too many coincidences. And then there's the way Mr. Morton looks at me, as if he knew something about me that I myself don't know. Samuel put his plate aside, fixing on her that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond words. "Be careful, Elena," he finally said. "You're playing with fire." She nodded, recognizing the warning, but inside her burned a determination that not even fear could extinguish. Something was happening, something more complex than the simple story of dispossession she had initially assumed, and she wouldn't rest until unraveling the truth. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. The following Wednesday, while she worked in Isabel's office organizing recent correspondence, Mrs. Morton was urgently called to attend to a matter in the stables. A valuable horse had suddenly fallen ill, and the veterinarian requested her presence. "I'll return as soon as possible," said Isabel, visibly worried. "Please continue with the correspondence." As soon as the door closed behind her, Eleanor jumped up. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. With quick but careful movements, she took the red leather diary that she had discovered on her first visit from the last drawer. She sat down again behind the desk, with her heart beating rapidly, and opened the diary. The first page revealed an elegant but firm handwriting, different from Isabel's. The date, written in the upper corner, corresponded to more than 30 years ago, May 15th, 1870. "Today I have made a decision that will change the course of my life," the entry began. "I cannot continue living this lie, no matter how much my father insists it's for the good of the family. Money and social position are not worth the price of my soul. Matthias and I will marry in secret on the next new moon. I will abandon the Morton surname and all it represents. I will be, at last, free." Elena felt she couldn't breathe. Matthias? The same Matthias Valenzuela mentioned in the documents she had found in the cave? She quickly turned the pages, reading fragments here and there, reconstructing a story that gave her chills of amazement. Constanza Morton, the daughter of old Morton, had fallen in love with Matthias Valenzuela, the legitimate owner of the lands her father coveted. Despite paternal opposition, they had married in secret and fled together. Constanza had adopted her husband's surname and begun a new life far from the valley. "I am pregnant," revealed a later entry. "Matthias is radiant with happiness. He says our son or daughter will be the living proof that love can transcend the hatred between families. I have asked him to forge a medallion for the baby, like the one he gave me, a symbol of our union, of our shared roots." The following pages narrated the life of the couple in their new home, their difficulties, their small joys, and then a tragic turn. "My father's men have found us. Matthias insists we must flee again, but I am tired of running. This is our home. These lands belong to us by right. I have decided to confront my father, make him understand that his obsession is destroying innocent lives." The last entry was dated October 1873, coinciding with the letter Elena had found in the cave. "All is lost. My father has refused to listen to me. He says he would rather see me dead than married to a Valenzuela. Matthias and I will leave tonight for the north, where his brother has a small farm. I leave this diary hidden with the hope that someday the truth will come to light, and if we have a child, I will tell him who he really is. Not just a Valenzuela, but also a Morton, heir to both bloods, to both stories." Elena closed the diary with trembling hands, trying to assimilate the magnitude of what she had just discovered. Constanza Morton and Matthias Valenzuela, united in secret, which meant that her grandfather, the child Constanza was expecting when she wrote that last entry, was both a Valenzuela and a Morton, and that made her, Elena, the legitimate heir of both families. The sound of footsteps approaching startled her. Quickly, she put the diary back in its place and returned to the correspondence she had been organizing. The door opened and Isabel entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold and concern. "The veterinarian thinks it's just a colic," she informed, removing her gloves. "Nothing serious, fortunately." Elena nodded, struggling to maintain a neutral expression despite the emotional storm raging inside her. "I'm glad, Mom," she managed to say. Isabel observed her attentively, as if perceiving the change in her attitude. "Are you all right, Elena? You seem disturbed." "It's just tiredness," she lied. "I've been working on the correspondence without rest." Isabel didn't seem completely convinced, but didn't insist. "Perhaps you should finish for today," she suggested. "It seems a storm is approaching, and it would be better for you to return to town before the weather worsens." Elena looked out the window. Indeed, the sky had noticeably darkened. Black clouds were accumulating over the mountains, and the wind had increased in intensity, lashing the branches of the garden trees. "You're right," she agreed, beginning to gather her things. "If you don't mind, I'll continue with this on Friday." Isabel nodded, approaching to help her organize the scattered papers on the desk. Their hands met briefly over a letter, and Elena felt a sudden and inexplicable impulse toward sincerity. "Mrs. Morton," she began, not knowing exactly how to continue, "have you ever felt that there are secrets in this house? Things that remain hidden, but somehow continue to influence the present?" Isabel looked at her with an intensity that confirmed the question had touched something deep. "All old houses have their secrets, Eleanor," she finally replied, "and the families that inhabit them as well. Sometimes it's better to let the past rest." There was a veiled warning in her words, but also something more, a weariness, a resignation that suggested Isabel knew more than she was willing to admit. "Of course," Eleanor nodded, gathering her shawl. "Thank you for the advice." The carriage was already waiting when she went out to the porch. The sky had darkened even more, and the wind now howled among the trees of the entrance path. Isabel accompanied her to the vehicle, holding her by the arm, as if fearing the wind might drag her away. "Be careful on the road," she said with genuine concern. "If the storm worsens, tell Francisco to stop at the Gibson Inn, halfway. You can spend the night there if necessary. Attention. The story is very long. There will be a second part.